Invest Africa, proudly brought to you by KPMG.
While African countries do the bulk of their international trade with Europe and America, very little intra-African trade is taking place. This is compared to Europe's intra-continental trade of 60% and 40% in North America. So why are African countries not trading more with each other? Philani Nyalunga sought to get some answers to this question.
Intra-African trade has been ranked as one of the lowest in the world. EcoBank says only 12% of Africa's trade is within the continent.
There are significant challenges facing African trade, and they consist of basically two types. There are tariff and non-tariff barriers to trade. The tariff barriers, over the past 20 years in Africa, there's been enormous progress made in trying to reduce these, and many African countries have reduced their tariff barriers significantly. But the biggest challenge is probably around non-tariff barriers, and by that we mean things such as policies and transport costs and infrastructure shortages and all the things that inhibit trade on the continent to a vast degree. There's evidence that shows that up to 75% of delays along major transport corridors on our continent are directly related to these non-tariff barriers. So those are pretty much the two major things that are facing us for the continent.
According to The Economist, poor infrastructure has long been a matter of concern on the continent.
Any region of Africa needs infrastructure because Africa is a country which is enough on the land, water, and human being. Now, today's position is that anything which you transport, the main thing is the transport cost. Sure. When you talk of transport, then transport whole infrastructure come, roads, railway, and then you need water for the agriculture. Yeah. So you need a lot of water. And to run the water, you need electricity. So there are three major portions: water, electricity, and the infrastructure to movement of the material which you produce here.
Standard Bank estimates that Africa will need to invest at least $100 billion in the next decade towards its infrastructure development if it is to realize its economic growth potential. However, Africa's trade relations with Asia, Europe, and America seems to be strong. According to the United Nations Economic and Social Council, China and India now consume 12.5% and 4% of Africa's exports respectively. This presents 5% and 8% of those countries' imports. We asked if poor infrastructure was the only reason for Africa's weak intracontinental trade.
It's one of the important stumbling blocks, but not the only one. They're basically, I would imagine, three. The first one is infrastructure. Yes, there is a deficit that exists on the continent. There's an off-cited World Bank study of 2009 that said our infrastructure deficit is approximately $93 billion per year. So it's a huge amount that we do have a backlog in infrastructure. And recently, President Zuma has also said that over the next few years, we're going to have to mobilize $480 million for infrastructure alone, and he is the presidential champion of the Presidential Infrastructure Initiative, and so that's one element. But then the other two elements that exist are also our trade and export diversification. You know, how competitive are our exports compared to other markets in the world? So, you know, part of this is that while we want to be regionally integrated and regionally competitive, the ultimate goal is actually global integration. And in doing so, we have to make sure that our exports are competitive.
The United Nations believe that if African governments want to boosting intra-African trade, they have to create more space for the private sector to play an active role in the process. With massive markets opening up on the continent, intra-African trade has the potential to create employment, attract investment, and foster growth in Africa. Philani Nyalunga, CNBC Africa, Johannesburg.
Joining me now in the studio to take a closer look at intra-African trade is Martin Davies. He's the CEO at Frontier Advisory, as well as John Craven, the head of corporate finance at Export Trading Group. And in our Nairobi studios, we're joined by Kwame Owina. He's the CEO of the Institute of Economic Affairs. Gentlemen, thank you so much for making the time to join me. Martin, let me come to you first. 12%, this is against 60% and 40% in other parts of the world. Why are we seeing such dismal stats?
I say it's not too bad. It's not too dismal. I mean, looking at comparing Asia, where in the European Union the figures are typically 55-60% of all trades intra-regional. Now, they have very deep value chains driven by intra-regional manufacturing. There are two regions which trade intra-region less than us. Middle East, probably about 8% of all trade intra-regional, and also South Asia. South Asia's trade, I believe, is 6%. So we're not that bad. But I think looking at sort of a 12% figure, which is often bandied about, I hear 10, I hear 9, it's in that sort of range. We're talking specifically more around Southern Africa. If you're looking at an East African context, and Kwame, I'm sure, will talk about it shortly, the East Africa region is significantly higher. So they're doing a far better job in regional integration and banging economies together, enabling trade flows, which is obviously beneficial for particularly landlocked countries in their own region. But of course, there's more we can do. But with inter-regional trade really comes about with deeper embedded value chains, i.e. manufacturing sectors. Maybe before we talk about inter-regional trade, we talk about how do we boost manufacturing in the region, and that will naturally result in a more integrated sort of supply chain, value chains that ultimately our region requires.
Kwame, I'm going to come to you just because I feel that Martin has thrown the gauntlet in your direction. And let's speak a little bit about East Africa, and obviously acknowledging the gains that this particular region has against other regions. But what is stopping this from trickling down so that we have intercontinental trade, or is that a rather lofty ideal that I'm going for?
Okay, to start with, I think Martin is right, but we have to be very cautious. The problem with percentages or shares is that it gives the impression that this is a very big amount. If you take the entire 5 countries of East African community, the quantum of trade in dollar terms is not really that high, even if the proportion that is shared among them is. So I think that is first Africa's problem in general, that the economies are small and the amount of trade that is reflected as a proportion of the GDP may give a bigger share than it is, but in real terms, it's not too much. But coming now to East Africa, I think one of the things is that, yes, the East Africa community is highlighted, especially on the continent, as one area in which, a regional bloc in which the deepest integration has taken place. And of course, I concede that, but I think it could be much, much faster. And the East Africa has its own problems. But among the things is that basically, I think the vision was clear in terms of the treaty. And obviously, with the customs union coming about, we expect trade to be much, much more open. One other thing that also has to happen is, if you think about East Africa, I think one of the cautious things that prevent other regions from fusing with East Africa is, or the regional blocks throughout the continent from coming together, is the fact that in every region there's one dominant country. And so everybody tries to preserve their own turf, and that tends to prevent a lot of cross-regional trade much more than would. Of course, infrastructure and all those are problems, but East Africa certainly is leading, but I think it could go much faster than what is, than the case is now.
I definitely want to come back to this issue that Kwame raises about the one dominant country. But before I get that, Jean, let's talk about the non-tariff barriers, which seem to be the key stumbling block in terms of getting to intra-Africa trade. Why are we not winning on this front?
I think a lot of measures or regulatory measures put in place, some date back to days when we had colonies Africa was colonized, and a lot of governments and trade blocs haven't focused enough attention in terms of lifting these regulatory barriers. I mean, the amount of documentation taken towards, exporting between, trading between these countries is massive. Never mind the delays from a structural point of view, but it's just overwhelming. And then again, the legal framework. A lot of countries, still haven't got a common legal framework, and this is causing another barrier to effective trade. So we're seeing a lot of smaller, under the radar issues, that are also making it quite difficult for a lot of companies to operate, cross border. And touching to Kwame's point, we've got, the East African trade bloc and SADC, where you've got, in certain extent, these trade blocs are competing with one another. Yeah. And there's a lot of potential flow between SADC and COMESA and other trade blocs that, I think if one can harmonize a single trade bloc potentially across, even sub-Saharan Africa, that might alleviate a lot of these regulatory issues quite in the short term.
I keep hearing a very thematic thing coming from you, Jean, and that's harmonization, and bringing together and coordination. Martin, let me come to you, and I guess this also ties up with the point that Kwame made about dominant countries. Are policies addressing the short-term losses that could possibly be incurred from regional integration as against the long-term benefits that countries stand to accrue if they were to harmonize and coordinate policies and the like?
I think there's two things to consider. Firstly, is that every region needs a regional hegemon, firstly. So we have Kenya, East Africa, South Africa, the United States, China, if you will, or Japan. And what has happened, if you're looking at sort of economic history of those cases, is countries on the so-called periphery, the Mexicos, in Asia, the Taiwans, the Hong Kongs, the Singapores, the Malaysias, the Vietnams, increasing Indonesias, on the periphery of manufacturing machine are able to capture that value chain. And this results not so much of a specific country competitiveness, but a regional competitiveness. Look at South Africa, for example. South African manufacturing sector has been hollowed out quite dramatically in the last decade and a half or so, largely because of not so much the China price, but as I referred to, the Asia price.
Right.
And that's effectively it. As we're getting hollowed out, where does South African manufacturing shift to? Does it shift to Mozambique? Does it shift to Botswana, Namibia, in search of lower cost of production, a more productive cost of production perhaps? No, it doesn't. It offshores and disappears. Perhaps it goes to China. Very different case what we're seeing in the US, shifting manufacturing into Mexico, Korea into China, Japan into China, Hong Kong, Taiwan into China. So there's not this regional value chain we have in our own regions. It's quite a unique phenomenon. I think what you say is, yes, every region should have a regional hegemon.
Yeah.
But at the same time, how does the harmonization of policy you refer to, how do we start to get across this very short-termist protectionist sentiment that many smaller economies have in the region? Often deservedly or understandably so, they would have this. But I think the economic upside of liberalization is not entirely clear to these governments at all. So end result being, we have these regional secretariats, regional economic communities, SADCs, ECOWAS, COMESA and the like. But they claim to represent a regional economy, but they're nothing more than, often nothing more than just a simple, meaningless acronym.
Right. I've got about 2 minutes to go, so Kwame, I just want to come to you quickly and bring you in on the point of how do we improve the productive capacity of local industries? Because if we've been listening to what Martin is saying, he speaks a lot about developing that manufacturing capacity, and it seems as if this has been a problem that's long-standing on the African continent. From where you sit, what do you think should be done?
Well, I think that productive capacity, especially talking about East Africa, will not grow organically. So it must involve, yes, some piece of links internationally that allows for a small portion of the value chains to exist here. So definitely FDI should be encouraged. And I think the protectionist policies that we see, especially in trying to cover up a region for whether the hegemons or domestic companies, I think is one of the biggest barriers to that. So in my view, many countries, especially those Kenya specifically and a few others, actually have to just unilaterally liberalize and allow new people, wherever they may come from, to actually come here and establish a portion of those value chains. Because if Africa doesn't hang on to these value chains very soon, its industrialization could take much, much longer, and of course, its people will stay in poverty for much.